Impressive, formidable, and overmighty, the Douglas family were renowned warriors and castle builders who became the most powerful dynasty in medieval Scotland. The dramatic rise and fall of their empire is one of the bloodiest tales in Scottish history. But it's a story that begins a long way from these shores. The defining episode in the story of the Douglas family didn't happen in Scotland, but here in Spain. Robert the Bruce's dying request was that his heart be taken on crusade against the enemies of Christ, a mission that one of his knights, Sir James Douglas, loyally agreed to carry out. And his journey created the Douglas legend. In this series, I'm going on a personal journey, uncovering the stories behind the family names that have shaped the nation, names that many of us either share or know day to day. And of all the families with a famous Scottish name, there can be few more notorious than that of Douglas. If Scotland has a holy relic, then it must be the heart of Robert the Bruce, which is buried here at Melrose Abbey. But this national icon of patriotism was ruthlessly exploited by the Douglas family and used in a calculated campaign to make them the greatest dynasty of late medieval Scotland. The Douglases adopted the striking image of Bruce's bloody heart as their coat of arms, and the kudos of their association with Scotland's national hero would bring them enormous power and success. Walking down any city high street today, it's impossible to escape brand names and logos. We may like to think that marketing hype is a modern concept, but the way the Douglas clan cashed in on their association with Robert the Bruce's heart is a perfect illustration that there's nothing new in this world. And just as today, where global brands ruthlessly push their image, so the Douglases exploited theirs. In Edinburgh's National Museum of Scotland, there's remarkable evidence of just how far the Douglases went to promote their clan identity. As curator David Caldwell showed me, the Douglases made sure their brand was instantly recognisable.
So here we are, just an ordinary wooden dish, but when you turn it over the other side, look what we have.
It's the Douglas heart.
Exactly so.
Was this normal at the time to put your own brand on your cutlery and your crockery?
I can't think of any other example of this type of thing at this level. And it's a fairly unusual situation, I think. What it is it's a really big, important household marking its property. In Scotland at that time, if anybody picked this up, they would see that heart, and I think they would immediately make that connection that this is something to do with the Douglases.
You can't escape the Douglas logo. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Even on your porridge bowl.
Yes.
The man who earned the family the right to use this iconic symbol was James Douglas. He was born in 1286, when the Douglases were a middle-ranking family with a few scattered lands in the south of the country. But all this changed when Scotland embarked on the bitter struggle for independence from England, a fight that transformed the fortunes of the Douglas family.
The context for the rise of the Douglases, the background to the family's emergence, are the wars with England.
Before the Wars of Independence, you could still argue that the centre of Scotland was in the centre of Scotland. But with the concentration on the relationship with England that becomes overwhelming as a result of the outbreak of war, the defence of the border becomes an overwhelming political consideration.
The Douglases were now on the front line in the War of Independence. Douglas Castle, which lay close to the border, was vulnerable and was grabbed by the English. Into the fray stepped the 21-year-old James Douglas, determined to reclaim his family's lands. Here at Douglas Castle, he showed just how utterly merciless he was prepared to be. One Sunday morning, the English soldiers left the safety of their garrison here at Douglas Castle to do what all good soldiers want to do, and that's to go to church. What they didn't realise was that James Douglas and his forces were lying in wait. According to the story, the English invaders had vastly superior forces, but they were outwitted by the Scots with gruesome consequences. The English were quickly overwhelmed, dragged back to the castle where they were ruthlessly butchered. The whole incident became known as the Douglas Ladder on account of the bodies which were piled high. It was a clear signal that James Douglas was a professional soldier capable of cold-blooded brutality.
To the English, he's a bogeyman. His readiness to mutilate captured English prisoners, particularly the severing of fingers from English archers, indicates a man deliberately spreading terror amongst the enemy as a way of deterring English opposition.
There is no doubt that Douglas, above all the knights of Scotland, including the king himself, was the one that the English feared most.
Black Douglas, as his enemies called him, was soon a trusted comrade of the leader of Scotland's struggle for independence, Robert the Bruce. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 gave Douglas the chance to be part of Scotland's most historic victory over the English. It's claimed that Douglas played a key role in the Scottish army and was knighted here on the battlefield by none other than Robert the Bruce himself. And in true Douglas style, it's said that he pursued the fleeing English king Edward II all the way from here to Dunbar. The victory at Bannockburn led to independence for Scotland. Bruce became king, and Douglas was celebrated as one of Bruce's most loyal knights. But ironically, it was only when Bruce died that James Douglas got the chance to immortalise the Douglas name and propel his family into the big time. It had been Bruce's dying wish for his heart to be taken on crusade to the Holy Land. Sir James Douglas was the knight chosen to fulfil this noble mission.
Douglas taking Bruce's heart on crusade resonates with a medieval audience for the very fact that this is an ultimate chivalric quest.
The choice of James Douglas is a mark of favour. It's an indication that the king views James as his best knight.
In spring 1330, James Douglas set off on his quest to Jerusalem with Bruce's heart. But he never made it to the Holy Land. His journey ended here in Andalusia. I've come to the small Spanish village of Teba to retrace the steps of Sir James Douglas. Some 2,000 miles from his homeland in Lanarkshire is this unusual but touching memorial to one of Scotland's most famous knights. Douglas's role as Bruce's right-hand man in life and in death was immortalised by the famous medieval poem, The Bruce, written by John Barber in the 1370s. In the poem, Douglas is cast very much as the supporting hero in a Hollywood-style epic. According to Barber, the good Sir James Douglas was travelling to the Holy Land with a group of knights when they were invited by the King of Spain to join forces in a battle against the Muslim Moors. The Scottish knights assembled with the Spanish army at the Castle of the Star outside the village of Teba on the 25th of August, 1330. Although the Muslims were defeated, the Scottish contingent were cut off. In a bid to save one of his fellow knights who was being attacked, Douglas found himself surrounded by Moors with no hope of escape. Barber's epic poem relates how the fearless Douglas threw the silver casket containing Bruce's heart ahead of him as he fell to his death, shouting, "Onward, brave heart, Douglas shall follow thee or die." Douglas's noble quest to take Robert the Bruce's heart on crusade had enormous appeal to a medieval audience, and it still captivates people today.
It is a good way to die for a knight. It is esteemed. It is the ideal death. So if you're going to go what better place than on the battlefield?
This great sense of the comradeship, the loyalty of Douglas to Bruce, the friendship that they had is, hyped up within, a few decades of the good Sir James's death, and it's taken on by the family in following centuries to just show how Douglas and the crown are almost one and the same.
They brought Sir James's body back from Spain and buried him here in St Bride's Church in Douglas. By dying on crusade, Douglas would be remembered not just as a brave and patriotic knight, but as the man who'd given his life to fulfill the dead king's final wish. It was the best kind of medieval PR his family could have hoped for.
And this is the tomb of the good Sir James himself. There's something really quite compelling about being so close to the bones of this great national hero, because it makes you realise that this was a living, breathing human being. And up there too, we can see the symbol of Bruce's heart.
With Bruce's bloody heart as their trademark and the kudos of Sir James's noble death, the Douglases leapt into the foremost ranks of the Scottish nobility. The Douglas family were now favourites of the crown, rewarded with lands and an earldom. The descendants of James Douglas set about empire building.
The Douglases are ruthless, greedy for land, greedy for status, careful about their family's reputation, but also ready to take enormous risks in the defence of their family interests.
They were very politically astute and very good at doing what nobles do best, acquiring land. It made them the greatest landowner in Scotland, greater by far than the king himself. Land is the key to power.
When they helped bring rebellious parts of Scotland under royal control, they were further rewarded. Their position as Scotland's most powerful dynasty was now confirmed.
Thrieve Castle was built here on the banks of the River Dee in the 1370s by the third Earl of Douglas, Archibald the Grim, who was given this unflattering nickname by the English on account of his forbidding appearance. But Thrieve turned out to be a castle worthy of its owner's grim reputation.
A key element of the Douglas success story was their talent for building impressive strongholds.
Hi Chris, good to meet you. Hi, welcome aboard.
Castle expert Chris Tabraham took me across to the tiny island where Thrieve was built to find out how the Douglases revolutionised the art of castle building.
Chris, Archibald the Grim, grim by name, grim by nature, and his castle here at Thrieve is a really impressive looking building.
It's not only impressive, it's really the first of a new breed of castles that came into Scotland. Archibald became Lord of Galloway in 1369. He came down here, he established himself on this ancient island, but he built a brand new castle, the likes of which had never been seen in Scotland before. A huge tower house rising almost 100 foot high. That's equivalent of a 10-storey block of flats. It was state-of-the-art when it was built.
A castle like this is a status symbol. So what does it say about Douglas power?
This was built as an outward and visible statement of power and might. And that's what the Douglas dynasty was built upon, power and might. And Thrieve is the perfect symbol of that.
In medieval Scotland, land equalled power. The Douglas family's vast empire gave them massive political influence. The Earls of Douglas were among the most important and powerful men in Scotland, a position many coveted. So when the 5th Earl of Douglas died, leaving his young son William to inherit the title, other members of the Douglas family sensed an opportunity.
The new Earl of Douglas, William, was just a boy of around 15 when he succeeded his father. Now, young William was set to become one of the most important figures in Scottish politics, but the insatiable appetite for power within the Douglas family itself was about to turn very ugly.
In the Middle Ages, and I think what we get from medieval history is that family, whilst very important, is one thing, but power is another.
Well, you've basically got these very young Earl of Douglas and his younger brother, and they are an impediment in the way to the ambitions of their uncle. Oh, is their wicked uncle.
The wicked uncle in this instance was James the Gross. James was an extremely powerful man in his own right, but he wanted the top job in the family. He wanted to be the Earl of Douglas, and he would stop at nothing. James arranged for his young nephews to be invited here to Edinburgh Castle to dine with King James II, himself still just a boy. But the invitation was not all that it seemed.
According to legend, a black bull's head was served to the unlucky Douglas brothers as they dined with the king in the great banqueting hall, a symbol perhaps of their impending doom. Accused of trumped-up charges of treason, they were dragged from the castle and immediately executed in the courtyard outside.
Thanks to the Black Dinner, as it became known, James the Gross achieved his ambition and was named the 7th Earl of Douglas. Under his ruthless control, the family became even more powerful. The Douglases were now the biggest landholders in Scotland, with massive wealth and influence. They had expanded their empire under a series of weak monarchs, but by the late 1440s, the young king, James II, was coming of age and beginning to assert his authority. The relentless ambition and arrogance of the Douglases was about to be their undoing.
They've got big, and as usual, when you get to that point, you forget, to be politically astute, and you're going one step too far.
All of the flashpoints that we see are textbook examples of what can go right, but also what can go wrong. And in the case of the Douglases, it actually ends up going very, very wrong.
The Douglases were never shy when it came to boasting about their achievements. And at the end of the 1440s, they commissioned an epic poem which did just that, the Book of the Howlet. At the National Library in Edinburgh, I met up with medieval literature expert Nicola Ryan. Nicola believes that the poem gives a unique insight into the Douglas mindset and why they came to be seen as a threat to the Scottish crown.
Nicola, why is the Book of the Howlets such an important manuscript?
It's such an important poem because of its glorification of the Douglas family. It goes through the Douglases' achievements over the past 150 years. And we get a sense of the Douglas family being very secure, being in charge of their own publicity.
So it's really a piece of propaganda. They're blowing their own trumpet, yet making a political point at the same time.
Yes, you could describe it as a piece of propaganda, certainly as a piece of spin. They talk about the crown and the king. The only king they name is Robert the Bruce, so that's a king of 150 years ago nearly, which might actually niggle the new king rather than necessarily support him.
It seems to be a dangerous game they're playing here, because on the one hand they're bigging themselves up, but they're also risking the wrath of the king.
It could be seen as an attack on the king, and it's certainly possible that James II might have read it that way. Their sense of entitlement and their sense of righteous possession would be threatening to a young monarch coming in.
In 1443, power passed from James the Gross to his son William, who became the 8th Earl of Douglas. Not only was William the greatest landowner in the country, he also inherited the position of governing Scotland while the king was still a child. But as James II reached adulthood, it became clear that he was increasingly frustrated by the Douglas stranglehold on his kingdom. Bravery on the battlefield and shrewd politics had put the Douglases in control of Scotland, but they were about to make some big mistakes.
William Douglas and his family were held in high esteem, not just in Scotland, but throughout Europe. And in February 1449, they held a spectacular jousting tournament. French knights travelled all the way from Burgundy to attend. This was another clear and overt statement of Douglas' power and influence, but this time it would prove to be a statement too far.
I've come to meet historian Richard Oram to find out how this event brought them into conflict with the Scottish king.
Richard, can you paint me a picture of this spectacular event?
This is the equivalent of one of these great international sporting events, for want of a better term. This is something that is going to be attracting knights from all across Europe. This is bringing in people from throughout Scotland. It's an opportunity for the Douglases to get up there and just demonstrate how important they are at home and abroad.
And where does the king fit into this?
Well, the king technically is presiding over the tournament. He is the one who's going to be the judge of events, and he'll end the fighting and things like that. But he's 18, just come 18. He's only beginning to come into his political maturity, if you like. So the event should be about him, but he's actually really fairly marginal.
How do you think the king felt about this?
Well, a teenager who should be the centre of attention, getting edged out by somebody who's a lot more glamorous, who has got this great following. It's got, you know, ladies swooning over him all over Europe. You can imagine how it must have gone down with a king who's really feeling that his kingship is perhaps being made second class in front of this audience from the world.
Relations between the Earl of Douglas and James II were about to reach rock bottom. Douglas incensed the king by signing a bond, which was a kind of alliance with two other powerful Scottish nobles. While we don't know the details of the bond, James almost certainly saw it as a direct threat to his position.
The king invited the Earl of Douglas here to Stirling Castle to discuss the bond. Now, there can be no doubt that Douglas was aware of the danger that he was in, because he asked the king for a guarantee of safe conduct. Now, the king gladly agreed to do this, promising not to harm a hair on his head. And so it was that a Douglas Earl came for a second fateful dinner appointment with a Stuart monarch.
They have power, wealth and status. And James II sees that and he wants some of that.
The king personally finds the Earl of Douglas, William Douglas, a man a few years older than him, an overbearing presence, who annoys him.
It was Shrove Tuesday, traditionally a feast day, but the merriment soon turned sour. I've come to meet historian Christine McGladdery to find out why.
Christine, what happened when the Earl of Douglas sat down to dinner with the king?
The king challenged Douglas to break the bond he had made with the Earls of Crawford and Ross, and the Earl answered, apparently fairly insolently, that he would not, and the king jumped up, stabbed the Earl in at the neck and once again down in the body. At the end of the attack, the Earl's body had 26 wounds. So it seems that everybody that was with the king joined in the attack and also added their stab wound to show their loyalty and to show that they were on side with the king. So it was, however you look at it, a frenzied and outrageous attack, and particularly outrageous in the sense that Douglas had come under letter of safe conduct.
The murdered Earl's body was allegedly cast out of the window at Stirling Castle, an indication of the king's disdain for the Douglas name.
The dead Earl's brothers were enraged by the murder. In revenge, they burned the town of Stirling. And to demonstrate just how worthless they thought the king's promises were, they tied the guarantee of safe conduct to the tail of a horse and drove it through the town. And taking things even further, they made a direct assault on the authority of the king by nailing a declaration to the doors of the Scottish Parliament demanding justice.
But the Douglases didn't get the justice they demanded. The Scottish Parliament exonerated the king, and there was worse to come. The family were about to pay the ultimate price for daring to challenge the authority of the crown.
James II finds the Douglases too powerful, too obstructive, too confident to live with.
The new and ninth Earl of Douglas was now facing a king who was determined to destroy their empire for good. But the Douglases were still a force to be reckoned with. Master castle builders, they strengthened the fortifications at Thrieve and had impressive strongholds across Scotland, like Bothwell in Lanarkshire. But one of their finest castles was here, just outside Edinburgh.
At the end of this woodland path is the site of one of the greatest Douglas strongholds, Abercorn Castle, and this is it. Now, there's very little to see, just a grassy bank and some trees, and the reason is because King James quite literally blew the castle to bits.
Despite their formidable defences, the Douglases were unprepared for the scale of the King's campaign against them. I met military historian Chris Brown at the army training camp at Otterburn to find out how James II used state-of-the-art medieval artillery to break Douglas power.
Chris, this is obviously not a medieval field piece, but it's a direct descendant, I imagine, of those early pieces of artillery that the king would have had.
In a sense it is. It's still a gun, it still burns powder, throws a shell out of one end. But the function of modern artillery is much more sophisticated. To a great extent, medieval artillery was focused on demolishing fortifications.
And how did James use this artillery against the Douglases?
Very simple and straightforward. He just gets his cannon as close to the target as he reasonably can, where his gunners will be in safety from arrows and firearms in the castle, and just keeps shooting at the same spot until a big lump of the castle falls down.
The King's campaign against the Douglases was relentless. With his empire crashing around him, James IX and final Earl of Douglas fled to England, leaving his brothers to face James II at the Battle of Arkenholm, here in the Scottish borders in 1455. The Douglases were comprehensively defeated, and no Scottish family would ever be allowed to amass such power again.
I think the Douglases are a very good example of the rise and fall of a dynasty. They're a dynasty who had secured a great deal of power, secured a great deal of land, and had secured a special place in the hearts of late medieval society. And by the middle of the 15th century, kingship had changed. And that's very much the clash that we see between the Douglas family and James II.
I think in the end, the Douglases just created a distortion in the balance of power that neither the rest of the Scottish nobility or the crown could countenance, and they were prepared to push it to the point where, something had to go, and in the end it was them.
It was nearly 150 years since James Douglas had secured his reputation as Black Douglas, feared warrior and comrade of Robert the Bruce. His exploits had propelled his family into the big time, but their ambition now lay in tatters, their castles destroyed, and the Earl of Douglas exiled to England. The heroic legend that had been born on a battlefield in Spain had been destroyed on a battlefield in Scotland.
In 1491, after almost 30 years of exile, the Earl of Douglas finally died. Douglas' power was well and truly broken. The family that had worn Bruce's bloody heart as its symbol would no longer be a force in Scotland.